The night everything broke open didn't begin with shouting or drama, but with the sterile smell of disinfectant and the hollow echo of hurried footsteps in a hospital corridor I'd never planned to see again. I'd been driving back from a late meeting when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and by the time the woman on the line said my wife's name and the word collision, in the same breath, my hands were already shaking on the steering wheel. I told myself accidents happened, that this would be a scare and nothing more, that Mara was careful and stubbornly practical, and always insisted on wearing her seatbelt even for a 2-minute drive. The building rose out of the dark like a concrete cliff, all white lights and glass doors, and I left my car in a spot that was definitely not legal because rules felt irrelevant when your chest is trying to tear itself open from the inside. At the front desk I said my name, said her name, said the word wife like it was armor, and watched the clerk's expression shift in a way that made my stomach drop before she even spoke. She told me someone was already with her, already signed in as her spouse, and for a few seconds I honestly thought she'd mixed up the files or I'd misheard her over the noise of the waiting room. Then she said the other man's name, and the world narrowed to a thin, ringing line in my ears, because that name belonged to the one person I never would have imagined standing between me and my own life. I'm called Aaron Pike, and for most of my adult life I built my reputation on reading people for a living, on understanding what they wanted before they admitted it to themselves, on finding the pressure points in deals that everyone else missed. I was 46 that winter, and for over 2 decades I'd represented athletes who lived under spotlights bright enough to burn, the kind of clients who could change a franchise's future with one signature. When a teenager from a frozen prairie town dreamed of a professional league, when a veteran needed one last contract that wouldn't insult his years, when a star wanted security that would outlast his knees, my phone rang. I'd negotiated agreements that added up to more than most people see in a lifetime, and I used to believe that meant I understood deception, leverage, and human nature better than most. What I didn't understand was how easily you can miss the slow, quiet betrayals happening in your own kitchen, how love can make you careless in ways no boardroom ever could, and how confidence becomes blindness when you're certain the people closest to you would never turn you into a stranger in your own story. Mara and I married when we were both still young enough to think ambition was a kind of romance, back when my office was a borrowed desk, and her job was coordinating events in a building that smelled permanently of coffee and ice. I was convinced I'd build something that would outgrow every room it started in, and she was convinced I'd survive the process, which in hindsight might have been the braver belief. We moved apartments more times than I can count, chased opportunities across cities, celebrated tiny wins like they were championships, and endured stretches where sleep was a rumor and weekends were theoretical. Somewhere along the way we added 2 children to the chaos, and they became the axis everything else spun around. Lena, now 17, turned discipline into an art form in the pool, waking before dawn with a focus that made coaches blink and classmates stare, stacking medals in regional meets like punctuation marks in a long, stubborn sentence. Theo, 15, lived on skates and tape and the smell of cold air, climbing through competitive youth leagues with a mix of talent and grit that made scouts start to take notes. I told myself they had my drive and their mother's calm, and I believed it the way you believe gravity exists, not because you test it every day, but because it's always been there. Julian Cross entered my life at a conference that promised more than it delivered, the kind of industry gathering where everyone pretends to be relaxed while measuring each other like chess pieces. He just finished a prestigious program, had a smile that worked like a key in most rooms, and the same restless hunger I recognized in myself. We spent a few years circling the same prospects, sometimes winning, sometimes losing, and eventually discovered over too much late-night bourbon that rivalry is exhausting when partnership is efficient. He became my right hand, the one who liked spreadsheets and projections while I lived in conversations and contracts, and together We turned a small operation into something that could open doors in cities I used to only visit for meetings. We hired staff, signed more clients than I'd ever imagined, and watched our commission statements grow from hopeful to absurd. Last autumn, we closed a deal that made trade publications call it a benchmark, and Mara threw a dinner that felt like a victory lap, with Julian raising a glass and telling stories that made our kids roll their eyes and laugh anyway. If you'd asked me then, I would have said my life was loud but solid, complicated but honest, and I would have been wrong in ways that still make my hands shake when I remember that hospital hallway. When I pushed open the door to the examination room, the air felt heavier, like it had learned a new way to press against my ribs. Mara was propped up with bandages that looked more dramatic than the injuries they covered, her eyes too bright with shock, and Julian was sitting close enough to touch her without leaning, his hand wrapped around hers as if it belonged there. They both looked up at the same time, and I watched her face drain of color in a way no makeup could hide, watched his expression shift through surprise into something like calculation. No one spoke for a heartbeat that felt longer than the drive it took me to get there. Then I heard my own voice telling him to step away, calm and flat, and nothing like the noise in my head, and I realized I was standing in the wreckage of 2 years I hadn't known existed. The words came out of them in pieces, not because they were trying to be kind, but because there's no graceful way to admit to a long, careful lie, and when the number finally landed between us, it sounded like a verdict. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I just left, because staying would have meant breaking something I wasn't ready to break yet. The house we shared felt like a museum after midnight, every familiar object suddenly labeled with a question I couldn't answer. I locked myself into the room where I kept contracts and calendars, and the kind of quiet that lets you pretend control is permanent. And I did what I've always done when emotion threatens to run the table. I went looking for patterns. Statements told a story my trust had edited out, with hotel charges on nights I'd been out of town, dinners priced for two, and a second card I'd never seen that led to an address I didn't recognize. Phone records filled in the margins, showing a rhythm of calls that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with proximity. When Mara came home and stood on the other side of the door asking for 5 minutes to explain, I listened to the floor creak under her weight and wondered how many explanations you can fit into 2 years before they become a second language. When I finally opened the door, what came out of me wasn't rage so much as inventory. Missed events, quiet substitutions, the way absence becomes a habit before anyone names it. I told her I'd already called a lawyer, and for the first time that night she looked like she understood that some decisions don't come with rehearsals. I called Julian once, not to argue, but to ask a question that had been needling at the back of my mind since the hospital. He answered like someone who'd been waiting for a verdict, and I asked him about a payment he'd made for Theo's team the previous season, a fee I'd thought came out of our joint account. He admitted it without drama, framed it as help, and I realized in that moment that he hadn't just crossed a line, he tried to buy a place inside my family while dismantling it. The next part wasn't personal, not really. It was procedural. I checked the documents we'd signed when we were still congratulating ourselves for being clever, found the clauses I'd insisted on because I prefer clean exits to dramatic ones, and used them. By the end of the morning, his access was gone. Our staff had new passwords, and clients were being reassured with the careful language that keeps reputations intact while doors close. If there's a mercy in competence, it's that you can move fast enough to keep chaos from spreading into everything else. Telling Lena and Theo was harder than any negotiation I've ever handled, because there's no leverage in a living room and no clause that protects you from the look your daughter gives you when you tell her the ground has shifted under her feet. I said the words as simply as I could, because padding them would have been another lie, and watched their faces change in ways that made me wish I could take language back. Theo asked if the man he'd called family for years was really part of this, and when I said yes, he went quiet in a way that scared me more than shouting would have. Lena cried and then apologized for crying and then cried again, and I told her none of this belonged to her, that adults don't get to outsource their failures to their kids. They wanted to know what would happen to their training, their schedules, their small, hard-won certainties, and I promised them the parts of their lives they'd built with discipline would not become collateral damage. If there's one thing I could still offer, it was continuity where it mattered. A few days later, Theo came to me with his phone in his hand and a look that said he'd aged a year in a week. Julian had written to him, not with an apology so much as an invitation to listen, the kind that dresses itself up as concern while quietly positioning blame. I told my son he could meet him if he wanted, because control only teaches you how to hide, not how to decide, and I asked him to record it so memory wouldn't get rewritten later. He came back angrier and steadier, said the man had cried, said he'd talked about complicated choices and feelings you can't schedule, and said he'd offered to pay for years of hockey if we would all just calm down. My son told him no and walked out, and I wrote that down in a file that already had too many reasons in it. Some lines, once crossed, don't lead anywhere worth going. Around the same time, I ordered tests I never thought I'd need, because betrayal has a way of making even your own reflection feel like a rumor. The envelopes sat on my desk like they were heavier than paper, and when I opened them, the numbers told me what my heart already knew, but needed to hear in a language that doesn't flinch. Both kids were mine in every way the lab could measure, and the relief felt almost embarrassing in its intensity, like I'd been holding my breath without noticing. I told them the truth because secrets rot faster in daylight, and because they deserved to hear certainty instead of guesses. Lena hugged me like she was trying to anchor something, and Theo nodded like a young man who's learning how to carry weight without dropping it. We didn't celebrate. We just kept going, which sometimes is the bravest version of joy you get. This is part 1. When you're ready, tell me to continue and I'll deliver part 2 in the same style. Fully original, deeply expanded, and carrying the story through consequences, rebuilding, career shifts, the kids' futures, and the long road forward. The legal part moved with a speed that surprised me and a cruelty that didn't, because paperwork has a way of making personal disasters look like accounting errors. Mara's attorney tried to paint a picture where my travel schedule became a motive and her choices became an inevitability, as if loneliness were a weather system instead of a series of doors you choose to open. My lawyer dismantled that story with dates and receipts and the kind of quiet persistence that turns rhetoric into dust, and somewhere in the middle of depositions and motions, I realized how much of my life had been built on the assumption that fairness was automatic. It is. It's engineered, argued for, and defended with evidence that doesn't care how tired you are. The court didn't reward drama. It rewarded consistency, and the record showed who had been present and who had been elsewhere when school meetings and early morning practices needed rides and applause. Custody settled the way I'd hoped, not as a victory but as a responsibility, and support agreements were written in numbers that looked clean on paper and heavy in reality. When it was over, there was no gavel smack moment that felt like closure, just a calendar that suddenly had different rules. In the middle of all that, an offer arrived that felt like a rope thrown across a river you didn't plan to cross. A larger firm I'd competed with for years wanted me in a senior role, wanted my clients, my reputation, my stubborn habit of overpreparing, and they were willing to put a salary on the table that made my old spreadsheets look quaint. It would mean letting my own agency become a chapter instead of a headline, and I sat with that choice longer than I expected, walking through rooms that still smelled like old arguments and early mornings. I asked Lena and Theo what they thought, because rebuilding is easier when you don't pretend you're the only one carrying tools, and they surprised me with a clarity that had nothing to do with money. They said peace is also a form of ambition, that starting fresh doesn't erase what you built. It just keeps it from owning you. I accepted the offer and gave myself a month to transition, and the day I packed the last box from my old office felt less like defeat and more like setting down something that had been burning my hand. Work became steadier in ways I hadn't expected, because distance does that. It turns echoes into background noise. The new team had resources I'd never had before and a culture that rewarded preparation instead of bravado, and I found myself enjoying the craft again instead of just the outcome. Clients noticed the difference, not because I told them to, but because attention shows up in margins and footnotes and follow-up calls that don't get missed. Julian's name stopped appearing in conversations entirely, which is how most careers actually end. Not with a scandal that makes headlines, but with silence that makes you irrelevant. I heard he tried to pivot into something else, that he'd moved a few hours away and told people a story that made him sound like a casualty of circumstances, and I let that be his project. Mine was teaching my kids how to breathe again without checking the room first. Lena turned grief into repetition, the way only swimmers can, counting laps like prayers and measuring progress in fractions that add up to futures. She qualified for trials that spring, and we booked a hotel that smelled like coffee and chlorine and nerves, and I sat in bleachers with 100 other parents pretending not to calculate what 2/100ths of a second could do to a life. She didn't look at the stands before she stepped up, and when she touched the wall she looked surprised and then unstoppable, and the hug she gave me afterward felt like the kind that says thank you without borrowing words. Mara was there too, somewhere behind us, and Lena kept the distance she'd earned, not out of cruelty, but out of a boundary she needed to build before she could lower it. That night we ate room service pasta and watched bad television and let victory be ordinary, which is the best kind. Theo's world stayed cold and loud and honest, and he learned what it means to be recruited without being sold, to choose programs that wanted the work more than the headline. When he told me about a scholarship that would keep him close enough for Sunday dinners, I pretended to negotiate and then accepted immediately, because some deals are just gratitude with paperwork. He grew into his gear like it had been waiting for him, and I learned to enjoy the sound of skates on ice as proof that not everything needs explaining to be true. We started a ritual of checking in without fixing, of letting bad days exist without turning them into projects, and the house found a new rhythm that didn't depend on pretending. I dated carefully, which is to say honestly, and discovered that honesty is its own kind of filter. There was a woman who worked with athletes' minds instead of their contracts, and she understood why some rooms in my life were still closed for renovation. We had dinners that didn't turn into interrogations and silences that didn't need translation, and when it ended it did so with thanks instead of accusations, which felt like progress even if it wasn't permanence. I stopped measuring healing by how little something hurt and started measuring it by how much space I had for other things. The day the final papers were signed, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt lighter, like someone had taken off a coat I'd forgotten I was wearing. The settlement was fair in the way accountants mean fair, and custody was clear in the way calendars like, and I drove home without music and let the quiet be enough. That evening we cooked something complicated and burned part of it and laughed, and Thea told a story about practice that had nothing to do with betrayal or resilience, and Lena corrected him about a rule, and they argued like siblings who have nothing left to protect except their pride. It was perfect in its smallness. A year later, I stood in a stadium that held its breath better than most people, watching my daughter walk out with a cap that didn't care about our history and a lane assignment that did. The race was brutal and clean, and she finished where she needed to finish, and I didn't shout because my voice wouldn't have done the moment justice. When she found me afterward, she said we did it like it had been a team project all along, and in a way it had been, because endurance is rarely a solo act even when the water only fits one body at a time. Theo filmed everything with a steadiness that made me proud in a quieter register, and later we ate terrible pizza and talked about nothing important, which is how you know something important has happened. I still run into people who ask about the old days like they're asking about a building that burned down but left a plaque. I tell them I learned a lot there, which is true, and that I'm grateful for what came after, which is truer. My work is better because my life is simpler, and my life is simpler because I stopped confusing loyalty with inertia. If there's a lesson in any of it, it's probably that trust isn't a contract you sign once. It's a practice you keep. And when someone quits the practice, you don't negotiate the rules. You protect the people who still show up. On quiet nights, when the house is doing that soft, breathing thing that only happens when everyone is where they're supposed to be, I think about how close I came to losing my sense of direction along with everything else. Then I remember that direction isn't something you inherit. It's something you choose after you've been turned around enough times to know what north actually feels like. We chose forward. We chose each other. And most days, that's more than enough.